navigate the wonderful virtual world. As I said, let's get started. Workshop number 3, an overview. And just a reminder to everyone watching, my name is Martel Catalano, and I'm the director of this nonprofit, Beyond My Battle, I mentioned earlier, who's one of the sponsors of this workshop. In the last 2 weeks, we talked a lot about what stress is and how it presents itself and behavior and how it in our body and in our mind. And today I really want to talk about relationships. We started to get familiar with our personal stressors and our stress profiles. Last week, what triggers us, what sets us off. Today, we're going to touch on the power of relationships for stress reduction. So people often ask me along these lines what my top recommendation is for stress management. And as a patient myself, I always respond with relationships. I'll get into that in the section on emotional anchors. We'll talk about what makes a caregiver or a relationship strong, which is essential to us as patients. Relationships go hands in hand, of course, with communication. And therefore, we'll talk about why it's important, why communication is an important ingredient for creating calmness. And we'll touch on qualities to bring to any kind of communication, no matter how we communicate. Importantly, we'll talk about adapting to changes in communication when you have ALS, not the typical stuff that, your ALS chapter has taught, really kind of our take on that. And then lastly, I want to leave you with some takeaways on mindfulness-based suggestions for coping with difficulty. So relationships. The top thing that I hear from patients living with any kind of illness or disability is that it wears on our relationships. When we're diagnosed with any kind of condition, a few things happen. And first, there's a panic, of course. We go into fight or flight mode and we're not thinking about any subtleties or anything to be soothing. We talked in week 1 about how all kinds of stressors fuse when you're living with a diagnosis, everything from social to cognitive, financial, emotional, of course, biological, and that gets really confusing and hard to sort out, which of course puts a strain on our relationships and therefore communication. But anyway, these are all underlying under the iceberg emotional stuff like shame and guilt that make things even more difficult. And last week we talked about how when we exhibit stress behaviors that often don't have any apparent connection to why we're upset. So it's no surprise that relationships and communication get strained. Many people also end up pushing relationships away or self-sabotaging by making them really, really difficult. And although that might seem easier than reflecting on our conditions and working on our relationships, it's definitely not the answer. Human beings are wired neurologically for relationships, plain and simple. Evolutionarily speaking, we need to know that somebody cares for us in order to survive, and it's why we have survived for so long as a species. At the top of the list. The quote from Dalai Lama here explains how we're social beings from birth. Not just that we need these relationships, but we're social beings. Our first relationship is a literal connection to our mother who is giving us life. And we are not infants anymore, of course, but we're not that different. We still need love and help. Interpersonal connection undeniably plays a major, major role in our health. And in fact, there's a great 80-year-long Harvard study that it began in 1938. I think it wrapped up a few years ago. If you search Harvard relationship study, you'll find it. And it found that our relationships have a powerful influence on our health, just as important as taking care of our bodies is taking care of our relationships, this study found, which I think is really insightful. So a term that I use sometimes when it comes to relationships is emotional anchor. These are the people we choose to communicate our emotions and needs with. It can also just be one person. We may not have and may not even need a boatload of people. One quality emotional anchor who cares for us is all we need. So the qualities of an emotional anchor that we lay out in our work are somebody who is safe, and this means who their tone of voice, gestures, facial expressions, choice of words are definitely never threatening, but ideally calming. We'll talk about this in a little bit. Secure, this is not somebody who like securely keeps us in a bubble or doesn't let us hear bad things. This is someone who responds to us in a consistent and predictable way, even when we're at our worst. And supported. So, someone who is willing to learn about our condition, hear difficult news, especially when we're not. And remember back to last week for just a moment how we talked about our emotional anchors or care partners are going to have their own stressors too. So if any of these 3 points, 3 S's feel strained for a quick moment, it's pretty normal. Everybody lets out a cry or a harsh couple of words sometimes, and everybody goes into fight or flight mode, and everybody messes up from time to time. But if any of these 3 feel like they're never present, if somebody is always dismissing an illness that's not theirs, or using harsh language, or not willing to be there, not showing up, then it's definitely time for a new emotional anchor. And your ALS chapter is there for you to help you navigate that. So communication, and I know that the severity of symptoms experienced by ALS can change on an individual basis. I want to say this up front, and all commonly experience some level of speaking difficulty. So as we get into these points about communication, I want you to keep an open mind, because communication does not have to be verbal. This slide shows a list that I often show all sorts of conditions and all sorts of patients, because some people can move and some people can, and some people can talk and some people can't. And communication really means listening as much as talking. Words can be communicated in many ways today. So to those feeling like communication has been ripped away from you, I invite you to approach this section with some self-compassion and openness. I'm going to talk about word choice in a couple of slides, so I won't get into that, but tone of voice may not be accessible to all, but it's definitely important to take note of regarding our emotional anchors, like I just said on the last slide. The next few as well: body language, gestures, facial affect, which is the affect of your face really means like, pursed eyes are not so great, scrunched face, tight jaw. All of that is definitely communicating stress, right? They might not be available to us, but they might. I'd be remiss really to not mention them as part of communication too. And again, part of what makes a good emotional anchor. Eye contact and listening. Are underrated components to communication. Sometimes we just need to be heard, or we need to be an ear for somebody else. And then, communication is complicated and made more so by a diagnosis of ALS. And there is no denying that the frustration and anger might give way to resignation around communication. And I want you to know that if not communicating is part of your grieving process, we talked about grieving, I think it was week 1 of this series. uh, if that's part of your grieving process, that's okay. It may be a phase of grieving that you need to experience. But that being said, some emotional qualities that can really help us through those difficult moments and bring us back to good communication are these 3 right here. So I have vulnerability first, because I always find it warrants the greatest explanation. Many people perceive vulnerability as a weakness, but vulnerability in relationships is different than having a vulnerable immune system. Uh, Without vulnerability, all relationships will struggle, because vulnerability in relationships, I see it as kind of like saying, here I am, these are my flaws, my secrets, my fears. and my love, right? We all of that included. We give ourselves to someone authentically, and when we are vulnerable, we get in return, "I see you. It's okay. You're safe here." Back. So vulnerability basically builds trust, and in relationships need trust to feel safe in them. And we need safety when our body doesn't feel safe to be in, right? So it's scary, but it's also very courageous to be vulnerable. And in my experience, and this is now well documented. Vulnerability helps bring us out of a place of shame too. So, as many patients know, we experience quite a bit of shame around having illness. Honesty requires us to be vulnerable, but honesty is also really brave and often avoided. I have found when we're not feeling our best, right? So we tend to not want others to know how much we're hurting, how tired we are, that things are getting worse for us. Some people avoid being honest when things are feeling good too, for fear that it could be used against them, depending in the relationships. I've heard that unfortunately a lot. But honesty is crucial because nobody is a mind reader at the end of the day. And like it or not, we're going to need help at times. I mean this kind of logistically, this honesty too. When I think about the kind of emotional honesty, I think of that more as vulnerability, but I think of honesty as a patient being in the sense of like, I'm not feeling well, things are not getting better, things are good today. So I mean this a little bit more logistically, like if we say that we're not feeling so great on Monday, honestly, and then on Wednesday our illness rears its ugly head, it will help our caregivers, it will help our doctors, it will help everybody, and honestly, it'll help us, and it'll deepen our relationship bond. And then openness is what I refer to when I mean keeping an open mind. So things are changing and perhaps rapidly so. That's incredibly, incredibly frustrating. And with an open mind to new options for communication, which we will talk about in a little bit, it won't be perhaps as bad. There's another Dalai Lama quote, just coincidentally, that says, "Pain is inevitable, suffering is optional." And with openness of mind, we can be more flexible and hold less expectations and adapt. All right. So by the way, don't worry, I do this with caregivers too, the helpful versus hurtful stuff, in case you're wondering. Um, I do it probably more with caregivers actually, because they feel like they don't know what to say. But I also find that patients don't know what to say. People say to me all the time, like, nobody gets me, nobody understands me. And the first thing I say was, well, have you told them? A lot of people haven't, surprisingly. So, and also the next thing I ask is, well, how did you tell them? Because some things can be really hurtful the way that we say them, and especially if we're in pain. The things we say matter, and how we say them matters equally. And again, I mean this communicating however you are communicating. Um, we have all heard the phrase, "It's not what you say, it's how you say it." After an argument, and this could be, like I said, verbally. It could be the use of a communication device. Words are words. Tone of voice, of course, plays into them, but really, honestly, words are powerful. It's important to reflect on what kind of words would be helpful or constructive, and avoid those that are hurtful and could push our caregivers away. So in the examples here, we have some common things patients feel and often do say on the left, alongside some alternatives. So I hear probably the thing I hear most is, nobody understands me, or people saying to their caregiver, "You just don't understand me." And I would suggest as an alternative, "I feel really alone in this, and I would like to talk more, even if you can't relate, even if you can't understand," which nobody can understand anybody. It is one of the things that I try to stress the most. Patients, caregivers, able bodied, anybody, nobody truly understands the other person. And of course, that is amplified when a rare disease is in the mix. Um, but we all need to talk, and we all need to feel heard, or just sit with somebody. right? So I feel really alone in this, and I'd like to talk more, or just you listen to me more, even if you can't relate. Um, Another thing I hear a lot is you don't care about me. This is a really hurtful one, obviously. I've definitely said it myself in my teenage years. And I think an alternative to this is to really explain why you feel that way, not just stating it like it's a fact. So when you say or do X, Y, and Z, it makes me feel unworthy, or it makes me feel super needy, or it's more dependent than I actually am, or it reminds me about my losses. Whatever it is for you, I would really recommend choosing more description. And you can already see here that the helpful responses do take a few more words, but that's because the hurtful things are definitely coming from that fight part of our our sympathetic nervous system that is acting out really bluntly, quickly, and shooting fast. So another thing, just we all say it: don't talk to me. Instead, I'm not ready to talk right now. Definitely much more understanding. We can give the idea that we will be ready at some point. Things change, moods change. Um, and then, of course, this isn't happening to you. This might be something we harbor inside as patients, but seeing people upset can sometimes be really upsetting to us. I know, working with all sorts of patients across the spectrum: cancer, ALS, diseases that I didn't even know existed, but are just absolutely, absolutely awful. I even think, sometimes this thought enters my mind to somebody having a bad day. I'm like, man, you have no idea this, you don't have this disease. Or, but with the relationship between a patient and a caregiver coming into play, I find that this phrase does creep out sometimes, and in various forms. But, I think an alternative here is, I would actually make this a longer response. Probably I'd say something along the lines of, um, this is really hard for me. I know it's hard for you too. All right. So, of course, talking about some changes in communication. In some of your worlds, the flow of communication might be changing. In others, you might be communicating through different devices. Others might be preparing for these stages. Alternative or augmentative communication is really wonderful, of course, but it can be frustrating. And learning new technologies, especially when dealing with a medical condition, is really stressful. So, communication charts and tables and eye gaze machines, it's a lot to comprehend, it's a lot to learn. I'm not here to talk to you about those devices, though, and those modalities, because you guys have all been there, done that, and have great, great resources available to you. I want to talk about adapting to those changes from a mindset kind of standpoint. Um, and the things that I think adaptation to change really requires of us, and why. Um, Flexibility being the number one. I feel like it's kind of synonymous with adaptability, right? But I see adaptability more as an openness to changing states, patterns, thoughts, ideas, just kind of an openness to change in general. Whereas uh, something outside of us changes, and we can adapt to that change. So we're talking about adaptability with all of these things here. Flexibility, excuse me, is more of a willingness to handle an unexpected circumstance, or make an adjustment or a compromise in the moment. And we deal with this a lot as patients. I'm sure some of you are shaking your heads. I think patients with chronic illnesses and disabilities, rare diseases, are quite frankly flexibility experts. But it takes some time. Takes some time. Uh, Patience. So the flow and pace of communication is bound to change, like I just said, and I find that practicing patience in mundane type of settings builds up patience that can then spill over kind of into more difficult situations. For instance, I'm just going to give you an example from my life. Like, I remember recently being in the post office and the line being super long, and just having, I don't think I had to necessarily be somewhere, but it was just annoying either way. And it was an opportunity to practice patience. When my grandfather is probably the most talkative man on earth, and he will talk for an hour straight about stories. So I practice patience every time I sit down with him. These are the kind of things that I feel build our muscle around patience. Like a muscle, we have to exercise it. And I really, really think of patience that way. I could use that analogy a lot, of course, with probably all of these things, but patience probably the most. In fact, I probably couldn't use that analogy with creativity. Or maybe I could if you're really trying to get good at a skill. But how you meet this situation, with creativity is a great question. How can we meet this situation that we're in with more creativity? I think that creativity is essential to adaptability. As some examples, it could be a really small act of just adjusting communication for yes or no answers, or yes or no symbols or signs when we're feeling tired or overwhelmed, and having an understanding with our caregivers around that. Maybe it's a funny symbol. Maybe it's like a yes or a no cat, or a meme, or something that you guys all love together. It can be something bigger, using a voice recording device early on and getting creative with that, recording your favorite stories or jokes so that we can tell them later on. It could just be tapping into your senses other than speech whenever possible. Compassion. So compassion is essential to change. And I'm going to explain why. And I mean self-compassion here, because it asks us to put our compassion itself, before we get to the self-compassion part, asks us to put ourselves in another's shoes, similar to empathy, but then to extend our kindness and our love to them. So we can do this with ourselves too. It's kind of baked into the very premise of being adaptive, because if we're going to adjust, it's likely that we're going to do so from a compassionate place and not like a resistant place, because we probably wouldn't change if we were super resistant or reluctant. Self-compassion is definitely another muscle to build over time, that becomes there for us in times of serious change or serious difficulty. When things change, we're bound to slip up or make mistakes, and it's only natural when we practice self-compassion in those moments. And sorry, I meant to say, when we practice self-compassion in the moments leading up to these chaotic moments or stressful moments, it's kind of waiting for us in the wings. And I find that there's a real opportunity to practice self-compassion and have it be utilized in times of great change or times of great stress. Every time we hear our critical inner voice, every time, becoming really familiar with that inner critic, the person who judges you, the person who tells you you're not good enough, who tells you you're not lovable, who tells you you'll never be this or that, or whatever the voice is for you. It's different for everybody, but I find that getting familiar with that voice and how it sounds in your mind, and noticing it first, like we talked about last week with the RAIN acronym. Recognize is the first thing. So recognizing that critical inner voice first, and then allowing that voice to just be for a moment. And then we talk about investigating and nurturing it. So that nurturing part with that critical inner voice would be like, having some kind of affirmation or mantra that, we're not that, or we're lovable just how we are, we're perfect just how we are, whatever it might be for you, that you reassure yourself I'm lucky to be alive today, one day at a time, whatever it is to bring compassion to counter that inner voice, will slowly start to build. And then every time it comes, you catch it and switch it, so that when these really difficult situations occur, it's waiting for us there. Um, and then lastly, releasing control. So I think this is an act of self-compassion personally. We don't control so much of what happens to us and around us. And for some reason we go through life thinking that we do. Um, Realizing that we don't is the beginning of releasing blame of what is happening to us. And realizing that we don't control things is the beginning of releasing the fear of change at all. So overall change honestly is a reminder that everything is unpredictable, everything is uncertain. And these are truths that we are working on to become more comfortable with in all of this work. So I have some final takeaways here. Um, I wanted to just kind of wrap this up by saying that maybe some of you had signed up for this webinar series thinking we'd be talking about like stress management tools the entire time. But just a reminder, like I said in the beginning of these series, all of those tools will just be those band-aids if we don't first get to know our stress and how we respond to it, and then learn about ways to communicate around it and build support systems around it. Without the insight that we've worked to gain these last 3 weeks, and I apologize, my radiator is knocking away in the background. Without the insight we've worked to gain from these last 3 weeks, we wouldn't really be able to truly and sustainably manage our stress, because so much is below the surface, like we touched on, and we have to dig for it. We have to kind of bring it up with us to the surface. So treating anything above the surface really doesn't tend to the roots, right? If we prune the top of a tree, we're not taking care of an infection at the roots. But what I want to wrap up with mostly is offering some more mindfulness-based suggestions. So maybe why did some of you did come. These are my personal, well, I guess I shouldn't say they're my personal, they're definitely an accumulation of many years and talking with different patients of all different kinds of things that we can do from a mindful perspective. Asking for help being number one. I place it at number one because I think it's the thing that many of us avoid the most. It doesn't seem like a mindfulness practice, but it is, and we can't do everything. We can't exert ourselves when ourselves, like our bodies, can't be exerted. And I just mentioned releasing control, and this is another way to do that. So asking for help might trigger those guilty feelings at the start, those feelings below the iceberg. But with time, we can reframe asking for help to be leaning into the release of control, and being present with the way things are. And some of us may already be dependent on others more so than some others in the group. But it never, for some, it's again, it comes back to the mindset. Like if some of us may be completely dependent on another person for care, but be so resistant and so unhappy about that, and so yeah, wishing things were different. And of course, there's every reason to wish things were different. We all wish things were different for all of us, but where we place our energy in those moments of receiving care is kind of what I'm referring to here. And I hope that that makes sense. Please let me know if it doesn't. Releasing assumptions. We talked about assumptions last week, but assumptions make things so much more difficult for ourselves. We talked about them, and I want to kind of relate them to relationships for a second. Asking yourself if you're really sure, if you're really certain about what you're thinking all the time, prevents us from going down rabbit holes of worry or assuming something to be worse than it is. So keeping an open mind that doesn't know everything allows us to allows experience in general to kind of roll off of us without attachments to any outcomes. So a lot of time, I think we make assumptions about our illness. We make assumptions about what other people have experienced who have our illness. We make assumptions about our caregivers, about what they're thinking about us, about what the strangers on the street are thinking of us. Asking ourselves, am I sure? Is just a really great practice. Am I sure? We don't really know, and a lot of times we think we do. So I use this term personal peacemaking in place of acceptance, because acceptance is a big word and one that I often struggle with using myself. I don't know that we can ever truly accept such a difficult and painful thing fully. Some people certainly have. Some people really, I don't know. Going back to the Dalai Lama, right? Some people certainly have. Um, but I'm not suggesting that we do here. Um, we can just work on it. We can work on acceptance and we can practice it. I think it ebbs and it flows. And I think it's a journey and not a destination. So in those moments of why or why me, I just offer really considering that there might not be a real answer. There might not be a real answer to why, and that's okay. The time we spend on these questions is time that we'll never get back. So try to see uh, life, if you can, as simply the way it is. And I know that sounds so much easier said than done. There's a book that I want to recommend around this subject. It's called How to Be Sick. And the author's name is Tony with an I, Toni Bernard. And I can't recommend it enough. If you're looking for a smaller version, there's also a How to Be Sick pocket guide. And on that note, cultivating genuine mindfulness, which is really just defined as a focused awareness on the present moment with curiosity and without judgment, is really what I spend most of my time trying to encourage. When you become aware that you're lost in a worrisome or anxious thought about the future, we can opt for finding something to bring our mind back to that's happening right now. So if it's your breath that you can witness, great. If it's sound, I use sound all the time as a mindfulness practice. Just close my eyes, or maybe not, just a soft gaze into the abyss and spend 10 minutes picking up on the sounds around me. The whole point of a mindfulness practice, whether it's body awareness, breath awareness, sound awareness. It could be sights. You could just decide you're going to look out the window for 10 minutes and observe passing people, passing birds, wind, motion. This is a mindfulness practice. And the entire point of it is for your mind to wander and you to bring it back again. So everybody says, I can't do that. My mind wanders too much. That's literally the point. So the literal point of mindfulness is for your mind to wander 1,000, 2,000 times in a sitting and bring it back over and over and over and over without judging yourself for mind wandering. Because guess what? You're a human being and that's what minds do. So yeah, I'm really passionate about helping people learn about this. Again, we have a lot of stuff on our website about mindfulness. But I think it's one of the greatest things that we can do as patients, to become present, to become back here right now, not into the future with how things might end up or might turn out. Um, yeah, I'm just checking here if I wanted to really share anything more about that, but when we have a mindfulness practice of any sort, it's really there for us in the most troubling of times. And it doesn't mean that troubling times won't happen. It just means that we will be able to meet them with some greater calmness. Like I said earlier, pain is inevitable. Internal suffering is optional. And lastly, it's so important, as we've been talking about communication, to find a communication outlet that works for you. So we just went over why turning to others is what we do during stressful times. It's the natural human response. It's good for our health and it's calming, all of that. And I really encourage you to find, like I said, one person who you know that can be a support for you. And there's great support within your ALS network that that is there for you too. So kind of along the line of personal peacemaking, really nobody can help remove the physical pain that we experience with any kind of illness. Nobody can help remove the pain of ALS. It's unfortunate, but it's true. But people, other people, can help remove the fear and the sadness and the guilt and the shame that is so common among patients. So with that being said, I wanted to let everybody attending know that we have support groups available on our website through the ALS.org website, and accommodations will always be made to anybody who's there. There's also caregiver groups if you're feeling like your caregiver needs some support in difficult times. So I wanted to offer those. Ours are offered weekly, and I think the ALS, I know the caregiver support groups are monthly, but these are the places to find those. And also on the last note, before we wrap up, I just wanted to mention that there is a podcast episode that we produced coming out. I forget what month, I think it might be April, where I spoke with an absolutely incredible individual living with ALS, who spoke to me through his eye gaze technology for about an hour, and we spoke to a meditation teacher about the ways that he has cultivated a sense of peace in his life, a sense of equanimity, to use his own word. And I just think it's the most beautiful conversation I maybe have ever had. So I can't give you an exact link for that, but I can say that the name of the podcast that will be on is called the Unfixed Podcast. So UNFIXED podcast, and it's on iTunes, it's on Spotify. Subscribe to it if you feel like listening to something in the coming months that is absolutely so powerful and inspiring. I just can't say enough good things about this individual. So really wanted to just drop a line there, and I'll check if there's any questions in the chat box. If you have any that you haven't asked, please feel free. And as always, you can reach us through the Beyond My Battle website. That's beyondmybattle.org, with any questions that might come up afterwards. I'll give this just a few minutes to see if any questions trickle in. All right, everyone, I'm not seeing any questions this evening. So it sounds like this is the end of our series together. I want to thank you for attending. Please keep in touch with us. Please let us know how we can improve this experience for the next group of people. I hope to send around a very, very short survey to get some feedback because this is a new service we're providing. So thanks for being the first to experience it. And like I said, please keep in touch with us and let us know if you have any further questions. Have a great, great evening.